Welcome to Podcast on the Brink, your weekly dose of Indiana basketball news and discussion, brought to you by the Assembly Call and Inside the Hall. I'm your host, Jerod Morris. Join me live at assemblycall.com every Thursday night and immediately following every IU game for our live IU postgame show. And visit InsideTheHall.com for complete coverage of IU basketball and to join the discussion in the Inside the Hall Premium Forum.
Welcome back, everybody, to a new episode of Podcast on the Brink. And I was chatting before we hit record here with my guest that he was, I think, offended that we've never had him on the show before. But he is one of the co-founders of the Assembly Call. He's a senior writer. I believe that's your title over at the Big Lead. He's a proud IU grad also. Ryan Phillips, welcome to your first appearance on Podcast on the Brink.
Thanks, Alex. And honestly, yeah, a little peeved. We've been friends for a while. Jerod, your co-host, is my co-host at Assembly Call, and we've known each other for a long time. I graduated with your sister Maggie and was friends with her. I never got an invite. I'm kind of, but hey.
It took a global pandemic for me to bring you on. So there you go.
I know, it's crazy, but bygones be bygones. We're good. Well, let's do this. I'm just excited to be here. I love this podcast. It's one of the ones I listen to all the time.
So one of the reasons I wanted to have you on, not only are you kind of plugged in on IU basketball because of your duties at the Assembly Call, but you're also covering sports at large and college sports at large for the Big Lead and kind of writing on a variety of different topics and. The last couple of weeks, there hasn't been a ton of IU basketball news to digest, but there has been a lot from the NCAA in terms of what they're going to do with fall sports, college football. I feel like something different is coming out every day in regards to whether they're going to play a conference, going from they're going to play non-conference games to they're not, to schedules and all that. Kind of from your perspective and, what you've read and what you've been able to conclude at this point. What are your expectations for what college sports might look like this fall?
Well, college football, I think, is going to start. I cannot tell you if it's going to finish, but I think that there's so much money wrapped up in it. Obviously, it is the revenue sport in college athletics, and I think that that is driving this push to definitely have a season and definitely have it in the fall. They could push it to the spring. Now there's weather implications and all of that to starting in January. But at the same time, you can work around that. There's a reason there's a push for the fall, and it's TV contracts. It's, whatever there is. And also you don't want to overshadow your other revenue sport, basketball, by having football at the same time. You want to be able to sort of separate those and allow them to get their own revenues and ratings and all of that stuff. So I think college football is going to start. I am not confident it's going to finish. But I will say that I think that basketball is in a different position because I think that teams can essentially isolate 12 to 16 players, whereas if you have 100 on a football team, there's no way to police what they're doing all the time, no way to keep them. I think some schools will do it well. I think some schools will do it terribly. That's just the reality, is that some schools will take this more seriously than others, and it could be one school ruining it for an entire conference. It's really going to be interesting. And I think each coaching staff is going to handle it differently. You've seen the reports out of Colorado State this week where they were telling players who were symptomatic not to report their symptoms because that would mean they'd have to quarantine for 14 days. And they said, hey, if you quarantine, you could lose your spot. And so that to me is just absurd. And that's how we don't get football. Is if people don't take this seriously. You had Colorado State players saying that, hey, there was a guy we knew was symptomatic next to us in a workout drill coughing, and he wasn't wearing a mask. And so, again, it's going to be team by team, conference by conference, and we'll see what happens. I think you might end up with a situation where we don't get a national champion, we just get a bunch of conference champions, and some conferences shut down. Well, like, for example, just throwing it out there, the Pac-12 finishes and has a conference champion. The Big Ten is done. They halfway through the season, they just say, forget it. And the SEC doesn't finish. The ACC does. It's all going to depend on individuals making smart decisions and I know a lot of people say, well, this isn't dangerous for younger people who are healthy and all that. That's true. But whether or not people are dying is not going to be what determines this. It's how many people are getting it, because those people can spread it. And the more people who get it, the more people who spread it, the more people are put in danger. So it's really going to be an individual thing, and we'll see how it plays out. The thing is, right now, nobody knows what's going to happen.
Yeah, I think the interesting advantage that college basketball is going to have over college football is, well, a couple things. One, they've got the benefit of time on their side, because it doesn't have to be a decision right now on when college basketball is going to start. They could, obviously, there was an interview that came out last weekend. I'm sure you saw it. Dan Gavitt, who runs the NCAA tournament for the NCAA, told Andy Katz that as of right now, they're scheduling things to be starting on time. We probably know that that's not going to happen, but right now it's August 7th. You can say it. It's 3 months away. College football.
There's no consequence to saying it's going to start on time right now. Yeah,
exactly. So college basketball is going to have the benefit of seeing what happens with college football. They're going to be able to see what they did right with college football, and apply that to their model, and they're also going to be able to see what they did wrong and try to avoid those mistakes. From a college basketball perspective, the interesting thing that came out this week, and I think you probably agree with me that this is very unlikely to happen, but John Rothstein and Jeff Goodman both floated the idea that the Big East and the Big Ten are talking about a bubble. I just don't see how that's a viable option, mainly because we're talking about college athletes who are not paid, and asking them to isolate in an area for 2 or 3 months. I don't know how long it would be or how it would work when they're not being paid. This doesn't seem realistic to me. Do you have any thoughts on I mean, do you agree with that? That seems like maybe a last resort type of thing, and could really kind of throw the whole amateur model, off of a cliff at that point and make it a Wild West.
Yes, I completely agree with what you're saying, because it's the kind of thing where, well, if they're just like every other student, which is the NCAA's, thing, is they say that these are just regular students who happen to play sports, then why do you have to isolate them in, I don't know, in Indianapolis for 3 months to get a season done while the rest of the students are able to stay at home and take their classes online and all of that stuff? So yes, there's that problem with that model. I think you could do, and I've talked about this a little bit, I think you could do a semi-bubble kind of thing, which is where you give guidelines to each school. Okay, this is what you're allowed to do. They all have to live in the same building. They all have to isolate. They all have to do this. They go to practice. They go to class, whatever. But even, go to class. They go to class online, which a lot of schools are going to do anyway. They do this, they do that, they do the other thing, and then they travel to games, and they get tested and all of that stuff. That might work. But yeah, isolating them all in a city for months on end when they're not paid and they're supposed to be just regular athletes or regular students, none of that is going to work. And we've seen that the bubble concept works. I mean, we've seen it with the NBA, we've seen it with the NHL. But like you said, these are kids. You cannot make them, who aren't getting paid, you cannot make them do that for months on end. And I think you'd have a lot of guys opt out. They'd say, no, I want to go stay with my family. Or if I'm going to isolate somewhere, I want to go here, I want to go there. But not being able to see anybody for months on end when you're a 20-year-old kid is you just can't ask that of them, I don't think.
I think the other thing we don't know at this point is what bringing all of the college kids back to campus is going to do to just the numbers in general in terms of testing positive and things like that. Because we've had a situation, and I can, I've followed it somewhat closely, the Big Ten schools, but obviously Indiana is what I'm looking at today. We've had a situation there where, to my knowledge, really the only students on campus for most of the summer have been athletes, and you're still having situations where you're having positive tests. Now, you can argue that maybe people aren't getting really sick or having to be hospitalized, but all of a sudden you throw in, 20, 30,000 students, I don't know exactly how many it's going to be that come back, and we've already seen with the baseball model that they've been given specific guidelines, right, to how they should do things. But all it takes is a couple of rogue actors to kind of step outside that, and all of a sudden you have a larger problem. I just can't
down the
see
league,
how,
essentially.
Right,
yeah.
Exactly. I can't see how at schools around the country, when you've got all these students coming back to campus, that you're not going to have the same problem pretty much everywhere.
Well, and think of the Big Ten specifically. There's a lot of big state schools, and as we know, having gone to IU, there's at big state schools. There's people from Florida, Texas, New York, California. I mean, they come from across the country, and so if it was just local people and the local situation was pretty contained, you'd say maybe they could pull this off. There's not a whole lot of that, but you've got people coming from all across the country where there's different situations with how this virus is, and they're all just converging on this town, and let's face it, it's a smaller college town. It's not New York City. It's not equipped to handle a massive outbreak of this, probably. And so, yeah, there's a bunch of things that could go wrong, not even including sports. Then when you throw sports into the mix and you're trying to get games done, I really think the Big Ten is going to have to leave a couple open weeks on the schedule somewhere, especially if they do start later. They might have some more leeway with that for games that get canceled. Because I think there's going to be games that get canceled for two guys got it and they were in contact with 7 other guys. We'll see what happens, but we can't play another team right now. I think there's going to have to be a buffer in there, and I think it's going to be that's something you're going to run into. You've seen it with baseball with they're just stacking double headers at some points in the season because there are missed games more than they expected. So the other thing I would say is that for basketball and football, one thing we saw with baseball, for some reason, they didn't plan for a massive outbreak. Like they just didn't. They didn't expect that to happen. And so there was no contingency in place. There needs to be a dozen contingencies on other contingencies and you plans in place and confirm like, okay, if Indiana can't play Purdue on this date, what do we do? Do we move it here? Do we do this? How do we react if there's an outbreak on a whole team? Do they forfeit the season or do we let them, get through it and then make up some games? Do we worry about winning percentage more than actual wins and losses? And, it's going to be a mess if one team gets pulled out. And so they have to have plans for that.
One thing that gives me confidence that if any league could pull it off, it's the Big Ten is I feel like from a leadership perspective, and I know Kevin Warren has only been on the job for a short time, but if you look at the leagues around the country in college sports that have been the leader, kind of leading the way on different things over the years, you look at the Big Ten right at the top of the heap in terms of, Big Ten Network. They were the first league to have that out. They've been ahead of the curve on many things. And you look at something like the Pac-12, and in a lot of ways, I would compare that to being run like Major League Baseball, right? Kind of not very organized. So the one thing, I guess, from the Big Ten perspective, I feel like the leadership is good. And listening to Scott Dolson talk the other morning, he basically said that the athletic directors are having a call league-wide every morning at 8 a.m. So I think they're going to have contingencies in place. I think they're going to have somewhat of a plan. But the problem is that you can plan all you want, but the virus is going to dictate how things play out. And to me, it's going to be interesting to see how these leagues handle, when guys do start testing positive during game week, what the protocol is going to be, how they're going to choose to make up games. I mean, they've got this schedule that it seems to be that's pretty ambitious when they plan to start, but I think they built themselves in, at least for football, a little bit of a buffer to be able to kind of shift things backward and make games up if they need to.
Yeah, and I would agree. I think that the Big Ten is a very well-balanced conference. It's from top to bottom with leadership and just ideas and being sort of at the forefront. I think that while the SEC gets lots of credit for maximizing sports financially, I think the Big Ten leadership-wise is really well-run. And it's funny being on the West Coast out here and seeing the Pac-12 just fumble around with everything, whether it be a TV deal or plans or anything. It is a stark contrast to see how the Big Ten has a very methodical way of going about things. And I do think that I have confidence that basketball is going to be fine. I mean, there'll be hiccups, there'll be problems, there will be, I'm sure one team will have an outbreak somewhere, whatever. But I have a feeling that's going to be fine. Football, I don't think there's anything anybody can do to make it safe. I really don't. And, there's just too many people in close contact and trusting too many people to act right. I think basketball, you can control a group of 15, 16 players and a group of coaches. I really think you can do that. I don't think you can do it for football.
I also think there's more of an incentive from the NCAA as an organization, which there's been a lot written about. Is this going to cause the NCAA to kind of the Power Five to break away? But the reality is the infrastructure that the NCAA has in terms of the basketball tournament is not something that these Power Five schools can just break away from and recreate in a matter of months. The tournament, based on everything that I've talked to a lot of people about this, and one point that always comes up, these are people that cover college sports on a day-to-day basis. They talk to people who are athletic directors, people that are making decisions at the highest level. And the one thing that constantly comes up is we have to have the NCAA tournament next spring, whether it be in March, whether it be in April, whether it be in May, for the NCAA to survive in terms of, it's their signature event. If you follow college sports, you know that they don't run the college football playoff. They don't run the bowl games, but they do run the tournament. And there's a huge incentive for them to be able to kind of get that back next spring. And I think they'll do everything possible to do that. So I think that's kind of another difference between football, whereas you're seeing these conferences are having a ton of incentive. The SEC, the Big Ten, they all want to have football because it's so important to the leagues from a money perspective, but the NCAA is going to also have a huge interest in having the tournament and making it successful come springtime. Yeah,
missing out on the NCAA tournament revenue 2 years in a row would be devastating because we didn't have a tournament this year, and it seems like it was almost a year ago, and it was only a few months ago we were missing out on the NCAA tournament, and so much has happened since then that in the retrospect that seems like a small sacrifice. But at the time, I mean, you have to remember how devastating that was to everybody. We were a week and a half away, or less than, it was a week away, essentially, from the NCAA tournament starting, and it was gone. And you're right about that. And there's two things. It's a signature event for the NCAA financially, and it's also a signature event to put a positive look on student athletes and the NCAA model. And in a time where that model is under assault, in my opinion, rightfully so, that's just a great advertisement for them to see everything's great. These players all came out and played their hearts out for the love of the game and, are getting educated and all these things. And without that, you start to get people flipping to the other side especially with the name, image, likeness stuff and everything that's going on. And now you're seeing players also exert their influence finally, which we haven't seen for a long time, and say, hey, we know how badly you need us now. Here are our demands to keep this model going. And I think that, losing the NCAA tournament and how desperate everybody is to make up that revenue and have college football to bring in new revenue, they're finally understanding how much money they make for all these, all these people in positions of power.
Yeah, one thing I think some people forget about when they talk about the potential for the Power Five or whatever, the major leagues to break away and form their own thing. If they do that, the NC and create their own tournament, you don't have the UMBCs at that point. You don't have Bryce Drew and Valparaiso making that shot. You don't have all these signature moments from the smaller schools that you think about when you have the NCAA tournament. If you're just playing a tournament with 65 teams from the major conferences, yes, you're probably still going to get the best champion every year. But part of what makes the NCAA tournament great, I would argue, is that first couple of days of games, right? We all think about the Final Four, but I'm more dialed in the first Thursday, Friday, Saturday, Sunday of the tournament than I am a lot of times by the end of it. The Final Four it's 4 teams. A lot of times it's teams that you've seen play all year, and in many ways it's predictable. I mean, every couple of years you'll have the George Mason or you'll have the Loyola Chicago, but the first weekend to me is what makes the tournament special.
Yeah, and that first 2 days, I think it's the greatest 2 days in sports because it's just and you know what, the NBA bubble has kind of recreated that where there's games on all day, because they're at limited sites, and it's been fun to watch an NBA game at 10 o'clock in the morning. I mean, it's whether you love the NBA or not, seeing superstars play at 10 a.m. 1 Eastern, but 10 for me, is awesome, and so having those games stacked back to back, all day. I remember being in high school and we had the cool teacher who rolled in a TV, and during our breaks we'd be watching, buzzer beaters, and there is something magical about that, about finally letting those Cinderella schools play the big guys, and it's the David versus Goliath thing we all love. That's why we all root for those underdogs, and so not having that does take away some of the magic from the tournament. And I agree. I don't think that Power 5 breakaway is going to happen. There's been rumored for years. I mean, there was rumors for a long time there was going to be that they were going to stay under the NCAA, but they were going to break off and form their own conference. It was going to be a super conference with like Texas and USC and Notre Dame and maybe Alabama and, just the, 10 biggest football programs would break away and form their own conference. But then you lose, the matchups, the classical matchups we've seen for years and the conference, rivalries and stuff. And I just think there is something magical about the way college sports are, and especially the tournament. The tournament is the pinnacle of that. And so, not getting, those random crazy upsets would certainly take away from it and diminish it.
I want to get into IU basketball specifically. I know it's been a somewhat quiet off season, but a lot has also happened with Christian Lander enrolling early, Justin Smith leaving, Demezy Anderson leaving. And in many ways, I think we're both pretty confident that the season gets played in some format, but I think it's a pretty important season coming up for Archie Miller. He was hired the same offseason that Brad Underwood was at Illinois and Chris Holtmann at Ohio State. Holtmann's already been to the tournament twice. Underwood, going into his fourth season, now may have on paper the favorite or the second pick to win the Big Ten. Archie's still kind of, I think, finding his way in this league. He hasn't finished in the top half of the standings yet. I think the expectations this year are going to be higher. Do you feel like this is the year that they could actually break through and be in that top tier Big Ten teams, or do you still feel like you need to see more before you're kind of buying the whole premise of them kind of being on the rise?
Well, I think it's a mixed answer. Obviously, I need to see more from certain players on the roster, and I need to see guys stay healthy. I mean, there's some guys that I think have a lot of promise on this team and have had promise on this team who aren't healthy and who haven't been. I mean, and covering recruiting, that Jerome Hunter was a stud coming out of high school, and so was Race Thompson. And those guys have not consistently stayed healthy. When they're on the floor, they can impact the game, and they can make this team much better. And I think Jerome Hunter is a huge X factor. If he's back to full strength and back to full go, I think he's a guy who can have a serious impact on the Big Ten, really. As far as with Archie, I think that this is the year, this is the prove it year. He's got his roster now. He's got the players that he wants. He's finally got a point guard in Christian Lander who can push the pace, which is something he's talked about relentlessly and that Indiana hasn't really done since he's been there. And, get buckets in transition. He's got a star in Trace Jackson Davis in the paint who is going to be, a first-team all-conference candidate. And if things swing right, he's going to be a player of the year candidate. I think that this is the time. He's also lost some guys who maybe didn't do the things he wanted, and Justin Smith and Devontae Green and, Demezy Anderson. Obviously, I think he would have loved if Demezy turned out to be a knockdown shooter from the outside and would have been willing to deal with some of his, defects in other areas of his game, but that never developed. So it's sort of trimming the fat a little bit and getting the roster he wants. He also has a group of freshmen who get to come in and be freshmen, other than Lander. Obviously, I think Lander's going to have an impact, but the other guys get to be role players. And it seems like every year he's having a freshman come in and have to shoulder a huge burden with Romeo and then Trace Jackson Davis, while Lander, I think, will be a star, will, play and play a lot. I don't think it's as reliant on him to do something for this team to be good. I think these guys can kind of learn along the way. And then those three other guys are rotation pieces who can provide energy and do what freshmen are supposed to do and provide a spark, learn the game, get better, provide a spark, learn the game, get better. And I think this is the year that, frankly, he has to show something, and he has to show that this system works, that his team can compete. And I think he's got the players to do it. Do they develop properly? That's a big question. Do they, did the guys get better from last year to this year? I think that's going to be interesting for everybody because of the weird year we've had. You're not having a traditional offseason. But guys like Hunter, guys like Thompson, even Trace, diversifying his game a little bit, being better with his right hand, shooting jumpers, Finney, can he stay healthy? And when, there are times Rob Finney's been healthy, he looks like a really good player. And then there are times where he just doesn't, and there's been no consistency to his game. If he's who we think he is, if Armand Franklin takes a step forward, that's a pretty good team he's got. Is it the top of the Big Ten? No, probably not. I mean, there's some really good teams coming back, especially with all the guys who stepped out of the NBA draft. But I think that this can be a really good team if, they stay healthy, and everybody develops the way they're supposed to.
What do you think the biggest question this team's going to have going into the season? For me, it's shooting, and it'll be shooting until I can see a season where they're, just average shooting the ball from the perimeter. I think if that happens, all of a sudden, I don't, everyone asks every year, well, what are 2 or 3 things they need to do better? I mean, they just need to make shots from the perimeter. I think on a more consistent basis, it's as simple as it sounds. Do you agree with that? And is there anything else you're looking at saying this has to get better if they want to move up the standings?
You're right. I mean, it's going to be shooting until they prove they can shoot. I mean, 32.6%, I think it was last year from 3. And, it doesn't matter how many inside shots you make. If you make a 2 and the other team runs down and can consistently hit 3s, they're going to beat you. And I think that, shooting is a big deal. I thought Al Durham took a step forward last year, but other than that, who on the roster are you confident is going to step out and knock down a 3? I think Jerome Hunter, and I mentioned this on the Assembly Call a lot, I think he's got a great shot. I think that timing was off for him a little bit last year. You saw him getting rhythm sometimes, but again, a year away from basketball, it's going to be awkward. He needs to start knocking down shots this year. Anthony Leal, hopefully, will step on campus and be able to knock some shots. Jordan Geronimo, hopefully, he's got a really nice form on his shot and a really nice jumper. Hopefully, he's able to hit some shots. And then hopefully a guy like Finney takes a step forward with his shot. It feels like with him, it's been a step forward, step back, step forward, step back. He'll hit some in a game and then look awful for a couple weeks. Armand Franklin needs to take a step forward. Those are a lot of guys. I just mentioned a lot of guys who need to take a step forward with their jumper. But you've got to be able to hit shots in basketball these days. I mean, this was happening even before the Warriors, but the Warriors really weaponized the three-point line. And that has trickled down to college basketball and then trickled back up to the NBA as guys graduate and get to the next level. People are watching, players are watching that thinking, oh, I've got to be able to hit threes to win. Indiana's got to be able to hit threes to win. And so, defending the three-point line, shooting three-point line, and then I would say wing scoring, I think, is another thing. There isn't really an elite wing scorer on this team who you can go to get buckets. That's what you hope Hunter is. So that's really, again, he's going to be a huge key. And everything I've heard is that he's doing really well and he looks really good. But we'll see when the bullets start flying.
One thing that when Archie talked, it was, I think, about a week and a half ago now, that made my ears perk up a little bit. He talked a little bit more about being more guard dominant this coming season. And that kind of got the gears going in my head about different lineups and maybe how this team can play differently than we've seen in the past. Because last year, I felt like having Justin Smith at the 3, Trace at the 4, and Brunk at the 5, you're not really giving yourself any chance to space the floor. You're really easy to guard when you have 3 guys that can't really shoot outside of 5 feet. I mean, Justin Smith liked to take shots from out there, but he couldn't make them, so he didn't have to be guarded. And we saw that multiple times over his career. The Ohio State example being the most kind of one that pops into my head, where they basically just kind of had a guy sag off of him and let him shoot freely.
That clogs all the passing lanes and everything
exactly.
as well, too.
So do you think there's a chance that we see something like Durham, Lander, and Finney starting with Jerome Hunter at the 4 and Trace at the 5, or do you think they're going to, maybe still kind of go with that 2 big front court with Trace and then Race or Joey?
I could see them going both ways, and I think it might be matchup dependent. And honestly, starting as we've all talked about this before. So who starts doesn't really matter. It's who plays the most. And I think that the lineup they're going to want to play. I think the lineup you mentioned with Lander, Finney, and Durham is going to play a lot together. And I think those guys being able to spread the floor. Now, look, if Race Thompson, and you've seen Race Thompson's high school film, he stepped out and hit shots in high school. Now, he wasn't a knockdown guy, but he could do it. And he has a pretty good shot for him. Last year, it did not show very often. But he can step out. Now, if he can step out and you can do, either Hunter or Durham and plus Lander, Finney, some matchup of those guys at the 3 perimeter spots, you get Race Thompson in there at the 4, or even slide Hunter to the 4 in some cases. You go 4 out, 1 in with guys who can make shots. That opens everything up for Trace Jackson Davis on the inside. And it opens up everything for those guys on the outside when you throw it into Trace. And if Trace can step out to the free throw line and be a threat from there, it opens up driving lanes and passing lanes underneath as well. So the ability to make shots, as you said, opens up the entire playbook and it unclogs the floor. And I really think that the lineup that you mentioned with Lander and Finney and Durham, and then either Hunter or Thompson and Trace, that lineup could be devastating if those three guys on the perimeter can hit those jumpers. And also because they can run the floor. That's the other thing. They can get up and down the floor fast. And so you can win easy buckets in transition. And Trace runs the floor. I mean, he's one of those guys that will get down the floor. The problem is that he doesn't get hit very often with passes. And I've said this 1,000 times. If you're a parent of a big man or you are a young big man, you run the floor, you'll get 6 to 10 more points a game because it's just effort and it's easy and you get down the floor fast. And as a point guard, you push the pace. You'll get more points a game or at least more assists. So I think that having that smaller guard lineup allows them to do a lot of things that they can't otherwise do. And you're right. This offense was stuck in molasses a lot of times when they had those guys who couldn't hit jumpers. And even if, it's a threat from Jerome and Rob Finney and Lander, even if they're a threat from out there, it changes the offense completely and really alters what the team can do.
So the Big Ten last year was on pace for what potentially a historic number of bids for the NCAA tournament. And I think most people are looking at the Big Ten going into next season. I had Jeff Goodman on the podcast. I've talked to Mike DeCourcy. They both were kind of in the camp that the Big Ten's, at least going into the season on paper, is going to be the top league in the country next season. Obviously, the NBA draft decisions are now out of the way. I think the big one that kind of came down last week was Xavier Tillman staying in for Michigan State. And then for Illinois, obviously getting Kofi Cockburn and Ayo back is a big deal. What do you kind of think of the league in general, the top teams? Do you feel like it's as stacked as everybody's making it out to be? I think Goodman had like 7 or 8 teams in his top 50. I mean, that's pretty impressive.
Yeah, no, I agree. And I think that the top, it's one of those things where there are some really good teams at the top, but I don't find it top heavy. I find that middle is really strong as well. But you look at, Illinois, Iowa, Wisconsin, all have really good players coming back and a solid team of players. It's not just one guy. Illinois, obviously getting their 2 guys. I mean, Ayo and Cockburn could both be first team All Big Ten next year. I mean, that wouldn't be shocking if that happened. And Ayo's such a gamer and he makes such tough shots in big situations. He's a guy who gets better as the game gets more tense. And so, but then you've got teams down the line that are pretty good. And Indiana is probably on the bottom of that top tier, like at the top of the middle, I would say right now. And it's obviously they can improve exponentially depending on, how they set up and how guys got better. But yeah, it's a swollen league right now. It really is. And there's really good coaches in the league too. I mean, it's the kind of thing where we often forget that there's really good coaching in this league. I mean, Michigan State lost Tillman and Cassius Winston. And are you really confident they're going to be terrible? No. I mean, they always have good recruits. They always play tough. They're always difficult to beat at home. They're always, a team with their system that is going to play really well. And they've got some good young guys and guys coming back. And they got Hauser as a transfer who's a really good player. And, they always reload. So even them, you see them lose their top guys and you're just sort of like, oh, well, they're going to be good again regardless, And so it's just a tough league. It really, really is. And you go a game above 500 in this league and you're assured of getting in the tournament. That's the way it's been the last couple of years. And it's going to continue to be that way. I don't see any huge drop off for the Big Ten anytime soon. And I think it's definitely the best league in the country. And I think it has been for a few years. 2
things to close out here. One, I know that you're somebody that goes to Maui every year for the tournament. This is IU's year to go. We were talking a little bit before I hit record about the likelihood of that happening. I just can't see it happening at this point. What's your level of optimism that you'll be going to Maui and watching IU basketball come November?
Well, Hoosier fans, I'd say start saving up for a few years because I don't think it's going to happen. I would love for it to happen. I had it all booked. I was already in line to get another press pass, and it's one of my favorite events, even more than the NCAA tournament. I think it's the best run tournament every year, and also you walk outside and you're in paradise. But it's actually a really well run tournament with great basketball. There's always Final Four threatening teams in it, and it's so much fun. And everybody's in a good mood, because even if you lose, you just walk outside and you're feeling great. So if anybody has a chance to go to that ever, I know it's very difficult and it's expensive and we're not in a great time economically and all of that stuff. If you ever have the chance to go to that, don't turn it down. Go. It is, even if IU isn't there, just go. It is so much fun and so enjoyable. As far as I'm concerned, it's not going to happen, and that's really sad for me, because I love going to that tournament. I try and go every year. I usually go. I think over the last couple of years, I've gone pretty much every other year, because it's just been a different scenario for me in life. But when I was younger, there's a year I went 7 years in a row, and every time was better than the time before. So. I don't think it's happening, sadly. I would love to see IU in it and to be there when IU's in it. I've been there twice when IU's been there, and both times they didn't perform well. So I was ready to see them, rise to the occasion this time. But I don't think it's happening, and it's kind of sad, because it's one of those things where that college basketball has started when you start seeing on ESPN those scenes from the beach in Maui. That, okay, college basketball has really started, and it's usually a great tournament. So a bummer for me to not get to go.
What's been their level of communication in terms of what they're saying, like the people who run the tournament?
I get emails every once in a while, and every email I've said has said, hey, we're planning to have the tournament. It doesn't matter, because tomorrow they could email and say, well, we're done. Right. But they've been once every couple of weeks, I get an email about what's going to happen in Maui and who's going to be there and all the latest news from the teams that are going. And as far as I'm concerned, they say it's still on, but I don't think that's going to hold up.
I got to close with your favorite Padre, who Jerod and I's team, the White Sox, gave away. I think it was for James Shields. Don't let me.
It was okay.
For big game James.
We give you James and money. That was the
okay. So you've got this, and the White Sox are doing fine. They've got a lot of really good young players, but Tatis Jr. is just one of the. You called him maybe the most exciting player in baseball right now. What's it been like to watch Jerod and I go into the fetal position every time you tweet about Fernando Tatis, and kind of watch your team get him for what is basically the twilight years of the James Shields' career?
What's funny is when we traded for him, he wasn't a rated prospect. He was a name because of his dad had played in the major leagues, but he hadn't played a professional game. He was only 17 or something. And so when you made that trade, you're kind of like, okay, they're dumping James Shields' salary, basically. I think the Padres paid half of James Shields' salary just to get him out. And it's been amazing. I honestly, I rub your guys' noses in it as a joke. You guys are doing fine. You have plenty of good young players.
Exactly.
You did what you did to us, or you did to the Cubs what we did to you by getting Eloy Jimenez. You're doing okay. And you made a killing in the Chris Sale trade as well. So you guys have done fine on those. So I'm gonna, but no, Tatis Jr. he's a joy to watch play. He has fun. He's dancing around in the dugout. He's always smiling. He's having fun. And then on top of that, he's a really good player, and he's really fun. And throwing on those new Padre uniforms, he looks fantastic. It is a blast, and it has been We're buddies, so of course I got to give you a little crap for that every once in a while. But I think the White Sox are gonna be fine. I'm totally down for a Padres White Sox World Series coming up at some point.
I tried to figure out a way to mute your Tatis Jr. tweets only, so look at the rest of your stuff, but I haven't. Twitter has not released that the instructions to do that, so I guess I'll have to live with a tweet every evening around a certain time. He hits a home run or does something, and there's the Ryan Phillips tweet. I'm laying in bed, and you're out there enjoying the beautiful weather in San Diego, watching former White Sox farmhand destroy the National League. So good for you. At least he's not on the Cubs. That's
right.
Right.
We're pretty harmless out here in San Diego. We really are. But it's been a blast watching him. He really is fun, and I am sorry for the enduring pain that it causes. I really am.
So Ryan, thanks for coming on. First time. We'll have to do it again. Where can obviously people know about the Assembly Call? Where else can folks find your work, and what's the best way to follow you? thebiglead.com, and then at Rumors and Rants on Twitter.
It's an old website I used to run that it's still my handle. But yeah, Rumors and Rants on Twitter, and then thebiglead.com. Check out what we've got. We have stuff every day, some great content every single day. So come check us out. And go to Inside the Hall. It's a great website that I'm on daily.
I've heard it's a decent website.
And
for those, I sent out a tweet yesterday for those who don't follow me. We're going right now to kind of every other week schedule for Podcast on the Brink for the foreseeable future. There's just obviously not a lot going on. It's the middle of August. I expect us to get back to more of a weekly schedule when the fall hits, maybe later in September, early October, and we know more about what the season's going to look like. If there is going to be a season, we're crossing our fingers that there will be. But thanks everybody for tuning in. Thank you for joining us this week, Ryan, and we'll see you again in a couple of weeks for another episode of Podcast on the Brink.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Podcast on the Brink. We always appreciate you being here. Remember to join me and my co-hosts for more IU basketball talk at assemblycall.com, and visit Alex over at insidethehall.com for complete coverage of Indiana basketball. If you want to support Podcast on the Brink, here is the single best way to do it. Tell anyone you know who loves IU hoops about us and suggest that they subscribe. Podcast on the Brink can be found on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, and everywhere else podcasts are available. Tell your social media followers, email your friends, text your family members. For weekly discussion about IU basketball, they need to be subscribed to Podcast on the Brink. We'll talk to you next time. Go Hoosiers.